Welcome to Deeper, a podcast about the Bible, theology, and Jesus. We want to be students of God's Word and God's world. Why is that? Well, because in the original language, the word disciple simply means student, which suggests that having questions, doubts, puzzles, it's not just okay, it's actually expected. It's normal. It's part of the growth process. Deeper is a space for deep learning, for quietness and cracking under the surface of things. So wherever this finds you, maybe you're in the car, maybe you're at home, maybe you're doing chores, we hope in the next few minutes enrich your life and feel like sitting at the feet of the world's greatest teacher, Jesus of Nazareth. My name is Ryan John Gregg. I'll be your host today. I'm sitting with my friend Lindsay Smith, and we're going to talk today about this theme that we're going to be exploring in the Bay Church this summer of arguing with Jesus. There are moments in his life through the Gospels of conversation that are like confrontation. And while that might make us uncomfortable, conflict averse, in Jewish culture, that's actually normal. In fact, it's a sign of love and respect to engage in debate with somebody. It's part of loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So we're going to spend some time thinking about arguing with Jesus and the very nature of debate, the very nature of learning. And that's what our podcast is going to be about today. So, cool. Lindsay, nice to see you again.
You too.
And what are we talking about today?
Well, we are talking about arguing with Jesus. So, I think I know the answer, but how do you handle arguing or confrontation? Is it comfortable for you, or is that a comfortable
I just scream
place?
as loud as possible, assert that I am indubitably right, and move on with my day.
Well, there you go. I think there's your answer. It makes me so uncomfortable. I'm definitely the type that, like, if there's confrontation or arguing, I just want to like crawl in my hole. So this conversation, this topic will be stretching. It'll be good. That's what I think.
But by the way, that's not how I usually handle confrontation.
Yeah, how is it?
I'm actually not confrontation averse.
Okay.
So I don't like to let issues simmer or kind of be pushed away. I like to bring them into the clear light of day and talk about them.
Right.
But I think it's about the spirit in which you do it, the timing in which you do it, just having the emotional intelligence about like how to make it a win and not a loss. But I actually think real talk is very productive.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I also notice when I avoid some of the harder conversations, it just like, the thought of it just still like festers in my stomach and stuff. Right. So I have to get to the point of like, of addressing it and talking about it. So anyway, I'm excited to learn how Jesus handled it.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay. So last weekend at church, we talked about Jesus and how he was kind of this like brilliant mind at a young age in the temple.
Right.
And so like he was just impressing all the elders and stuff. So what is some of the historical background that we should understand to understand this whole story a little better?
Yeah, there's quite a bit. Jesus is like a savant. Mm-hmm. And we're aware in our culture of kids who are like really brilliant at stuff. That kid's a prodigy in violin playing or in the spelling bee champions and stuff like that. Really impressive kids. The thing to notice in Luke 2 though is that Jesus, it really focuses. This is where Mary and Joseph leave Jesus behind in the temple, and they're like, "Oh no, where's Jesus?" Mm-hmm. He's not just holding forth and spouting all of everything that he thinks. He's actually listening. And he's actually asking questions, pursuing more clarity. So while this idea of debating I like that idea. Oh, good, I can ask questions. Yeah. I don't make the jump from there to sort of modern expressive individualism and say, oh, good, that means that I just get to bless the world with me, capital M-E.
With what I don't have to
don't have to actually humble myself.
Yeah.
To learn, to submit to people wiser than me. Sure. And so we see that model of Jesus. But to this idea that debating is normative in Judaism, so Judaism has, in addition to the scriptures, the Old Testament, they have a very important rabbinic writings. And the most important collection is called the Talmud. Mm-hmm. And there's two Talmuds, actually. One, it's from Babylon. It's called the Bavli. It's larger and more authoritative. And then there's a slightly smaller one called the Yerushalmi. It was put together in the land of Israel. And on a page of Talmud, so imagine this is a page of a book, okay? At the center, in a small square in large letters is a tractate called the Mishnah.
Okay.
And that's seen as oral law that goes all the way back to like Mount Sinai. But then surrounding the Mishnah are little excerpts of different rabbinic teachings on that Mishnah. And here's the thing. This rabbi up here disagrees with this guy down here and says it.
Interesting.
And this guy was this guy's student who actually spurred off out of this guy who he thinks is wrong. So on a page of Talmud, you're getting dramatized the imperative to debate, to question.
Yeah.
And so it's just in the bloodstream. And
Is that kind of like we have like study Bibles, right?
Yeah.
So would that be like looking at the footnotes of like the different commentaries?
Yeah,
and
it's
different
similar to
people
that.
that have written about a particular thing.
yeah,
Similar?
that's a great analogy. I mean, usually a study Bible is harmonized, so it all
Sure.
flows together.
Yeah.
Whereas a page of Talmud, they would say there's harmony in the debate. So
Yeah.
they wouldn't say, "Oh, this is a problem that there's debate." They'd say, "This is as it should be."
That's cool.
Does that
I
make
like
sense?
that. Yeah. I do like that. Yeah.
And this all flows out of the Bible. So there's a couple biblical touch points that we should be aware of that lead to this Jesus who loves learning, who's really smart. Deuteronomy chapter 17 is at the end of Moses' life. Remember, there's no king in Israel, but he says, someday you're going to want a king. Be all like the other nations. And here's what's important. He can't amass for himself a bunch of horses and military power. He can't amass a bunch of women. He can't amass a bunch of money. But that's what not to do. What he should do is write out by hand a copy of the Torah and read from it every day of his life. And that will help his heart not to either turn to the side or to be lifted up. And so the king is pictured not as this conquering military hero, but as a studious figure. And then Moses' successor, Joshua, in Joshua chapter 1, when God gives him, his commissioning, he says, you are to meditate on the Torah day and night. Don't let this book depart from your mouth. Like, just live in it.
Yeah.
And that same, and so that's the first page in the Jewish collection of the Bible. That's the first page of the prophets. After the Torah comes the prophets, former and latter. Then after the prophets is the section called the writings. And on the first page of the writings is Psalm chapter 1, which says, "Blessed is the man who meditates day and night on the Torah." It's striking the exact same note.
Yeah.
Psalm 1 is as Joshua 1 on these canonical seams at this new moment in the collection of Jesus's Bible.
Right.
And that's not at all accidental. In fact, you could do a whole study. There's a whole host of similarities between Joshua chapter 1 and Psalms 1 and 2 together. Very interesting study. But this emphasis then continues in the later prophetic literature. For example, I want to read from Ezekiel chapters 2 and 3.
Okay.
This is Ezekiel's calling scene. God says, "But you, son of man," who else is called son of man in the Bible? Jesus. That's language that he's getting from Ezekiel. And son of man in Hebrew, Ben Adam, son of Adam. That's what C.S. Lewis in Narnia.
Yes,
Son of
son of
Adam,
Adam. Yeah,
daughters of Eve. "But you, son of man, hear what I say to you. Be not rebellious like the rebellious house of Israel. Open your mouth and eat what I give you." And when I looked, behold, a hand was stretched out to me, and behold, a scroll of a book was in it. And he spread it before me, and it had writing on the front and on the back, and there were written on it words of lamentation and mourning and woe. And he said to me, "Son of man, eat whatever you find here. Eat this scroll, and go speak to the house of Israel." So I opened my mouth, and he gave me this scroll to eat. And he said to me, "Son of man, feed your belly with this scroll that I give you, and fill your stomach with it." Then I ate it, and it was in my mouth as sweet as honey. So, I mean, I don't know
Yeah.
a more dramatic image of
Very
intensely.
the drama. Yeah.
I'm consuming this knowledge. By the way, and then John the seer in the book of Revelation uses this exact imagery in chapter 10.
Okay.
He says, "The voice that I heard from heaven spoke to me, saying, 'Go, take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angel.' So I went to the angel. He has a scroll, and he said, 'Take and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth it will be sweet as honey.'"
I wish I could just like understand the Bible that way. Just like eat it and then I know it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
That's exactly the idea. And then one last example is, Paul, his protege Timothy. Timothy has known the Bible since he was very young.
Yes.
This is what it says in 2 Timothy 3. Paul's talking to him. He says, from early childhood, you've been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. All scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. So it's assumed that this pastor guy, Timothy, well, he's known the Bible since he was young, and he's immersed in it. He's living in it.
So is that like normal for Jewish culture for like young children just to like from a young age just be immersed in the Bible? If Timothy, Jesus was really young.
Yes.
Is that normal?
Yes is the answer. And so something fascinating, in Old Testament times, there's 3 holidays a year where you're supposed to go up to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. One is Passover.
Okay.
One is Sukkot, which is where you build little booths, in memory of the wilderness. And then the third is Shavuot, which is translated as the Feast of Weeks. Okay? And in Jewish tradition, Shavuot, which is 50 days after Passover, remembers God giving the law to the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. God gives the Torah on Shavuot, and that's the holiday that remembers it. Now, there's a Jewish tradition that you take little boys and girls to school for the very first time when they're 3, 4, 5 years old on Shavuot, on the day of the giving of Torah. And there's a variety of different traditions to make learning sweet and beautiful to children. So I want to read this excerpt. This is written by a guy named Rabbi Eliezer of Worms. He's a German Jewish guy in the 12th century. And he says this, it is the custom of our ancestors that they bring children to learn for the first time on Shavuot, since the Torah was given then. At sunrise on Shavuot, they bring the children, in keeping with the verse, as morning dawned on Mount Sinai, there was thunder and lightning. And one covers the children with a cloak from their house to the synagogue, or the rabbi says, you're covering the children like with a blanket so they can't see, because it's dramatizing this whole Mount Sinai moment.
Okay.
And they put the child on the lap of the rabbi who teaches them, in keeping with the verse, as a nurse carries an infant, Numbers 11. And here's the really cool part. And they bring the slate upon which is written Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. This is the Hebrew alphabet. Mm-hmm. They write the letters of the alphabet on a slate. And the rabbi reads every letter of the alphabet, which, by the way, is where we get our word alphabet, is from Aleph, Bet, alphabet.
Oh, that's
it's
cool.
the first 2 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Mm-hmm. And the child repeats after him all of the letters. And the rabbi puts a little honey on the slate. And the child licks the honey from the letters with his tongue. And then they bring the honey cake upon which it is inscribed, the Lord God gave me a skilled tongue to know, Isaiah 50. And the rabbi reads every word of those verses, and the child repeats after him. And it goes on and on. But the idea is that associating in the mind of a child sweetness and
sweet.
goodies with learning.
Yeah, that is cool.
And so in answer to your question, yes, there's a deep tradition of introducing very young, pliable minds to the things of God when they're most receptive, and it becomes kind of your native language. Is that cool? I'm going to do that with my kids.
I know. Well, I'm trying to think practically because, they're teaching Torah, yeah? That's the law.
Yep.
And so I'm trying to think of how I'm sitting down, even with my 6 and 8-year-old. I'm like, okay, here's the law. Enjoy.
Well,
like
here's
how,
yeah. So
like if I'm teaching them, I'm teaching Jesus, right?
Right.
And I think that's why it's kind of easy to introduce stories like Jonah and stuff because like a young mind,
right.
They're used to stories, and so it's easier.
The adult mind loves stories.
Well, I guess yeah.
The human brain is a story factory.
Yeah. So, but like we're starting with like Jonah, Daniel in the lion's den.
Right.
People carrying sick people on a mat to Jesus, and he heals them.
Right.
And so, but they're teaching like the law.
Well, the problem is that word, that translation, because the word in Hebrew is Torah,
Okay.
And law is only one meaning of it, actually.
Sure.
It more generally means instruction, guidance.
Yes.
And in fact, the Torah, if you look, and the Torah refers to the first 5 books. In Greek, it's called the Pentateuch, which means 5 scrolls. It is not primarily a collection of laws. It is primarily a collection of stories with laws interspersed. But here's what's so vital to see is that the stories contextualize the laws and not the other way around. It's not that the laws are the main center of gravity and the stories are in their orbit. No.
Yeah.
The story, the narrative of the covenant and God's plan, that center, and the laws are in service to that relationship.
Yeah.
And the word Torah is related in Hebrew to the word for parent, which is hore or hora, because it's a gendered language, and to the word for teacher. If you're a teacher, you're a more or a mora, which is related to Torah. So I'm trying to get to the idea of why is it that a youngster would love to study the law? It's actually because it's not the law. It's an amazing storybook that is filled with parental love and guidance.
Yeah.
And that's why
I think it's good. It's just like, so growing up in the, some of the things that I was taught, the law was like boring, you know? So I think it's like you have to have a shift, a mindset shift of like, that's not really what it is though.
Right.
It like what you just described, like it's all these stories and like, they're all getting at, anyway, you just said it. So just,
well, actually here, there's actually here a very, very important issue in Christian theology. So there was a guy in the early church named Marcion. He was a monk, and he thought there was a sharp difference between the Old Testament God of wrath and law and all that bad stuff, and the New Testament God of grace and love and compassion and all that stuff. And so his basic idea is, we don't need the Old Testament. The Old Testament is outmoded. And so this impulse, which reappears all the time in church history, it's called Marcionism. But the church has always resisted that and said, if you de-Judaize, if you de-Israelize Jesus, you've killed the whole thing.
Oh, you lose.
So as Protestants, this is one of the things that we need to be aware of, because Martin Luther, in his 16th century context, where he's trying to battle the Catholic Church, which has this accretion, layer upon layers of tradition and stuff that have become more important than the scriptures. And he's trying to reassert the importance of the original scriptures over against post-biblical tradition. Here's the key move. He maps on his own social disaffections, say, with the Catholic Church. He maps that on to a biblical idea of law and grace. So the Catholic Church equals Old Testament Israel, equals law, equals bad. The New Testament Church equals, I don't need tradition, all I got is the Bible, and that's about grace. And so what I'm getting at is, for the last 500 years, in a lot of Protestant thinking, there's been a very sharp, bright contrast between law and grace. Law is bad, grace is good. But that itself is radically oversimplifying what is actually going on in the Bible. And so this, a major event for the history of biblical studies was actually the Holocaust. And Christian scholars in Europe having to reckon with the complicity of the church in violent anti-Semitism. And part of what theologically enabled that was a negative reading of the law. Oh, those Jews are just Christ killers, and they're so law-obsessed, and they're legalistic, narrow-minded, bad people. And that was part of the narrative of anti-Semitism. And so what has happened in post-Holocaust scholarship is a complete reorganization of the relationship between New and Old Testaments, and to read sympathetically with the grain of ancient Jewish literature, which explodes that binary of simple grace versus law. Now, that's not to say that there's not a strong difference. If you can't read Paul without having to reckon with some deep sense of movement from God's manifestation of grace at Sinai and God's manifestation of grace on Zion through Jesus Christ. So we're not trying to flatten out all the differences. But all I'm getting at, so if you're listening and you're curious to follow up on this, it's the movement is called the New Perspective on Paul, actually. And it has to do deeply with a revisioning of what the law meant and how Christ relates to it. So that's an important thing, I think, for Christians to be aware of.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, but I love what you shared about the children and the cloak and the learning and the discipline being as sweet as honey.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Okay. So there's kind of like a stereotype about like Jews being like really smart.
Right.
They're large Jewish brains. So,
Yeah.
is that, like, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I've known some very, very smart Jews.
Sure.
My doctoral advisor's Jewish. Not only one of the smartest humans I've ever met, he's one of the funniest humans I've ever met. I love being around Jews. They just crack me up. They're so refreshingly irreverent. I like irreverent. But to what you're saying, I mean, there's a lot written about this. Jews have disproportionate representation in Ivy League schools, in Nobel Prizes awarded, in positions of wealth and power and prominence.
Yeah.
That's this question, well, why? What's going on? And whatever. You know, most answers start by talking about the immigrant mindset, because up until the state of Israel, the Jews didn't have a national home. And so they're always like the new kids on the block, or they're always a social outsider, which means they've got to have more hustle, more ingenuity, tight-knit community. We got each other's back. And also, we're not welcomed into other traditional vocations. They're not going to hire us over at the plant or whatever. So we're just going to stay home and read. By the way, you know where the word ghetto comes from?
No.
The word ghetto comes from medieval Venice in Italy, in northeastern Italy. And the ghetto is an Italian word that means the foundry, which is where they make precious metals and stuff. So basically the Jews lived in the ghetto because they weren't welcome in other professions, so they were jewelers and they worked with precious metals.
That's very
And that's why, you know, if you go to, but the term ghetto has then traveled, and it's related to, well, that's a Spanish ghetto, that's an African American ghetto, that's a whatever ghetto, right? But it's originally an Italian word affiliated with the Jewish community. The country of Israel today has like proportionately the highest rate of investment into research and development anywhere in the world. There's a great book called Startup Nation by Dan Senner and Saul Singer, and it's all about the Israeli entrepreneurial drive.
Yeah.
Think about people like Einstein, Niels Bohr, Marx, Freud, Bob Dylan, Mark Zuckerberg. There's a lot of very, very, Noam Chomsky, a lot of very influential Jews intellectually in our world. But I want to back up, because the question is, historically, where did that impulse come from? And there's two key moments I want to draw our attention to. The first is after the disaster of the exile in the Old Testament, and especially the southern exile. So the northern territory of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians, by Nineveh, in 722. About 150 years later, in the 580s, is when the southern kingdom is conquered and deported by the Babylonians. And in the centuries after that, something happens, and it's kind of like an historical black hole. We don't know all the details. But what happens in the centuries in the 5th century and in the 4th century in Jewish culture is this radical book religion movement. There is a radical interest in what eventually becomes our Bible. And, you know, it's wrong to say, I've heard this all the time growing up, that after the Old Testament, God was basically ghosted everybody for 400 years and then showed back up with Jesus, and nothing happened for 400 years. That's like really not true.
Sure.
Like, if you read history, a ton of stuff happened. Now, nothing that made it into the canon of the Bible, but there's a great deal of literature that was produced during that time and a great deal of history that happened during that time. So, and one of the things is the Jews become deeply bookish. Now, that is even intensified in the year 70 in the Jewish revolt against the Romans. And so there's a very famous story in Jewish lore, and it goes like this. Vespasian, this Roman general, is laying siege to Jerusalem. Okay, he's going to starve them out. And the Jews are desperate. It's obvious that this is not going well. And that the temple, which is in Jerusalem, that the temple is going to get destroyed again, and it's really not going well. And the only people who are allowed in and out of the city, well, is nobody except dead people. Like they'll let them take out their dead, but that's it.
Okay.
So this leading rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai fakes his death and gets into a coffin.
Okay.
And his disciples take him out to Vespasian. And he
Okay.
gets out of the coffin. And he says to Vespasian, basically, like, look, I get it. You guys are going to win, and we're not going to resist. I do have one request, though. I request that you allow me and my students to go out to this little village called Yavne, and we just want to study the Torah. We're not going to make any problems for you. We're not going to, rebel. Would you just let us go study the Torah? And Vespasian agrees. And this starts the first rabbinic academy in a city called Yavne. Sometimes it's translated as Jamnia.
Okay.
And so that is also an important moment where the center of gravity of Jewish faith shifts from temple to Torah,
Yeah.
to book. And so that's really important. If you're curious to go deeper in this, there's a great novel by she's an Israeli novelist. Her name is Yochi Brandes.
Okay.
It's called The Orchard.
Orchard.
And
okay.
St. Paul makes an appearance in it.
Oh.
Famous rabbis from the Talmud and from the Mishnah, they make appearances in it.
Okay.
It's about who's the main character? It's he's buried in Tiberias. What's his name? Darn, I can't remember.
That's okay.
But a very famous rabbi.
We got to get the book to find out.
You got to get the book. It's a great book.
Okay,
Yeah.
so what's our takeaway here? If we have
Yeah.
the life of the Spirit, and then we have this intense need to learn and
Yeah.
study, and how do we make those two fit together?
Yeah, because often those things are pitted against each other.
Exactly,
In
yeah.
Christian, especially in Pentecostal traditions like
Yeah,
ours, where it's sort of
like
like,
you're imparted.
I don't need to learn.
Yeah.
Because I got the Spirit. Like,
Yeah.
And that is not true.
Yes. Yeah.
These things go together. Interestingly, so we mentioned the holiday of Shavuot, weeks, which is the giving of the Torah. Shavuot is translated in Greek as Pentecost.
Okay.
So it's on the day of
Interesting.
Pentecost, so let's see it this way. Just as after the Passover, the ancient Israelites went to Mount Sinai and received the Torah, just so, after the Passover of Jesus' death, 50 days later, the early Christians received the Spirit, and they received tongues of fire. What do tongues do? They impart knowledge. They're communicating wisdom and knowledge. So there's a link there in the idea of Pentecost. I'll close with this story. There's a famous scholar named Gordon Fee. He's a New Testament scholar. And he grew up as the son of an AG pastor. Grew up in a very kind of charismatic Pentecostal setting. But he loved learning, actually. And early on, he heard a pastor say, or somebody say, I'd rather be a fool on fire than a scholar on ice. And the idea is that, scholars can't have a vivid spirituality. Scholars are just kind of dry, very, closed-minded people. And Gordon Fee said, I don't want to be either. I want to be a scholar on fire. And that was kind of his life mission, to say, I'm going to be radically open to the life of the Spirit and to God's presence, and radically love God with my mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a beautiful image of not submitting to this false choice between the life of the Spirit or the life of the mind, and to say, actually, those things go together. And we see it in Jesus. Jesus knows that stuff. Jesus is comfortable talking to the unlearned, but then when the troop of scholars and lawyers and big heads come from Jerusalem, dude, the guy can throw down footnotes like anybody. He can totally, both guns blazing, smart.
Yeah.
And so I think especially for our young people, this is such an important message, that the life of the mind is part of the life of discipleship.
Yeah.
And we can be disciples on fire, scholars on fire. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So
I think to put a simple analogy, because I live off those,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to have peanut butter, and that is the life, living by learning and your mind, and you could live off peanut butter, sure, but then you also have jelly, and that's like the Spirit.
There
and
you
could
go.
maybe live off a little. Anyway, but you put those two together, and it is a whole other experience.
Love it.
That is great. keeps you
Boom.
full, and
PB&J.
Anyway, PB&J. They're great, but you put them together, man, and you got something.
Love it.
Completely different experience.
Love it. Love it. Well, let's end there on that. I'm hungry anyway.
Go get
so
you a peanut butter and jelly.
that's awesome. That's awesome.
All right, that's good. Good convo.
Good convo. Thank you guys for joining. I hope this was really helpful. Deeper is a ministry of the Bay Church in the Bay Area in California. We'd love to see you at one of our services sometime, either online or in person. Check out thebay.church. Also, in our show notes below, there will be a couple links to a couple of the books that we mentioned if you want to follow up on your own time. And till we see you next time, I hope you're well. And as the rabbis say, shalom, homies. Bye-bye.